All right, France, 16th century. The first king we're interested in is known as Louis XII. Louis XII is the guy who more or less did in France what Henry VII did in England. Had been a tumultuous, protracted conflict. It was a woman, really, Joan of Arc, who successfully brought to a conclusion that war because of her genius in military strategy. She drove out the English. The English are licking their wounds on the one hand, and in some ways the French are too. It's thrown the entire social structure into some degree of upheaval. And the guy who really eventually comes out on top and starts bringing some stability is Louis XII, just as Henry VII did similarly in a kind of parallel story in England. So he was a noble class. He wasn't necessarily in line for the throne, but it was one of those situations where he's the guy that finally came out on top. So he stabilized France in some ways the way Henry did in England. He's most famous in history for his Italian wars. I'm going to skip by that. We don't need it. I'm not interested in it. But if we were just doing a detached study of history, we'd probably spend some time there. France had been, for many, many years, sort of doing incursions all through the Renaissance period into Italy, trying to get some kind of toehold there, and that became some of the backstory for the Renaissance. This guy continues that. In some ways, that may be one of the more important aspects of his career, but from our point of view, I'm just going to bypass that. He did marry a woman by the name of Anne of Brittany. France at this time is not consolidated. It's a kind of patchwork of various provinces, dukedoms and so on, you know, here and there. It wasn't until a successor ruler that France becomes something of what we would consider the modern nation state. This is pretty much true of all of Europe. We don't have those nation states really in view yet. They're just sort of being created at this point. Feudalism, at least the vestiges of it, has created a rather decentralized organization of things. Brittany was one of those little kind of dukedoms or small kingdom there in the upper northeast of France, and he marries her hoping to bring Brittany into the fold of France. They have two children, both daughters. The first is Claudia. Claudia eventually marries the successor king, Francis I. He was a French nobleman and kind of in the upper class there in France, and so she marries him and he will be the next king. We'll look at him in a moment. The second of their children, however, is named Renée. And so when we talk about Renée in a few minutes, this is the Renée we're speaking of. She's the daughter of a king. She's the daughter of Louis XII. She was born in 1510, the same time as John Calvin was born, and it's her story in part that I want to try to highlight as we go along this morning. Eventually, Anne of Brittany died, and Louis had still failed to produce a son. You know, this was the main concern of these guys at that time. And so he married a young, sweet thing from England named Mary Tudor. And you may recall, she was the younger sister of Henry VIII, and he was hoping that now in his waning years he could, through her, produce a son. They married. He was dead in 3 months. And you may recall the joke in France at the time, I mentioned this to you before, was that he died of overexertion. Now, I don't know, because the other joke that also circulated in France at the time, although it may not have been a joke at all, was that Mary Tudor really facilitated his death. She didn't like him much. He was an old man. She was young. She was in love with someone else. And so this marriage of political necessity was not anything she desired, and she actually was doing it more or less at the insistence of her family back in England. And upon the death of Louis XII, of course, she then married the Duke of Suffolk, who was really her love, and they became the grandparents of Jane Grey. Remember that? So that was kind of a side story there. So anyway, Louis XII dead. Most of these guys do die eventually. Next, Francis. Francis, as I say, married Claudia. So he was not the immediate, he wasn't the son, but he was the son-in-law of Louis and took the throne that way. He was the first of these French kings who decides that he'd rather love them than fight them, you know, and so the Italians, who had been more or less the target of military excursions from France. This changes with Francis, and he begins wanting to incorporate the great strides, the great achievements of the Italian Renaissance. And again, if we were studying just a detached history, we'd probably spend some time looking at that. But more important for our purposes is this. As I say, Francis was a French nobleman. He had a sister. Her name was Marguerite. Marguerite was married to a man whose name was Henry II, not to be confused with another Henry II. This is why this gets complicated. You got two Henry IIs out there. One is the King of Navarre, and Marguerite is married to Henry II. Now, Navarre is in the north of Spain. It's an independent kingdom just to the north of Spain, south of France, strategically located. And Marguerite is married to the king of that small kingdom there. So we'll keep her in mind for a minute. She ruled there with him, and they had one daughter, the only child they had, and that child's name is Jean d'Albret. And so we have Renee of Ferrara, we're going to see in a moment, and Jean of Navarre. And these are the two women that I want us to think about as we go along. Jean will eventually rule Navarre, and she'll rule it as a strong, committed Protestant and give great help to the Huguenot cause there in France. All right, Renee became, well, her father died. Louis died when she was 5 years old, and she's basically adopted now by her uncle, who is Francis, when she's 5 years old, and she is cared for in his court now for the next several years. I want to do a little more on her in a moment, but just to round out the story of Francis. Francis is probably best known among historians for a couple of things. He consolidates France. He really does create, more than it had ever existed before, what we would call the modern nation of France. He brings together this patchwork of various provinces and so on, and puts them more or less under one head. At the same time, he unites the Catholic Church in France under him. Not as dramatically as Henry, who repudiates the authority of the Pope, but he's certainly moving in that direction. He wants the French Catholic Church to really view him as a major figure in the church, and he wants to sort of distance the Pope, viewing the Pope as kind of a spiritual leader, and yet really Francis is more the main guy. So it's a kind of a compromise between a Henry VIII play on the one hand and what you might find in the rest of the Catholic world. This is his main claim to fame. He does bring together France and more or less make it this united political entity at the time. Interestingly, at the beginning of his reign, he was somewhat tolerant of the beginnings of the Protestant movement. Remember, he became king in 1515. Martin Luther had his evangelical epiphany in 1515 when he was there studying Romans chapter 1. We talked about him separately. The indulgence controversy with Martin Luther was 1517 to 1521. All of this quite early in the reign of Francis. I think Francis may have been interested in the Reformation because he saw in it some prospect of increasing his own status in the church. The main thing the Protestant Reformation seemed to represent to him was a criticism of the Pope and a criticism of the higher leadership of the Catholic Church, and he saw in that a justification to insert himself even more visibly as a leader in the church without necessarily repudiating the papal authority. And so I think he saw in the Reformation at the beginning some sort of political strategy that he might invoke basically to increase his own status. However, as time went on, he began to see that the Reformation was more than just a critique of the Pope. It was an entirely new paradigm for worship, for the nature of how the Christian religion should proceed, and the more he learned about it, the less he liked it. So that by the time we get to 1534, Francis has pretty much become intractable in his hostility to the Reformation. And 1534 becomes important because you may recall the life of John Calvin. He was a Frenchman. He grew up in France. He grew up under Francis I. He went to the University of Paris in 1529. He studied law. And of course, it was while there that he was converted to the Reformation faith through the influence of Robert Pierre, remember that, his cousin. He turned out writing the speech that was given by Nicolas Cop as his inaugural address at the University of Paris to become its rector. That inaugural speech was actually a great defense of the Reformation, so Nicolas Cop was chased out of town. John Calvin had to go underground. This is all under Francis I. And finally, Calvin himself fled France, and all of it was the severity of the punitive measures that were now being implemented by Francis in that time frame. Francis more or less put an exclamation point on all of this the following year when he had a great celebration in Paris. I'm beginning to use the word at this point, the Huguenots. The word Huguenot is really the word that's used, as I'm sure you're all aware, to refer to these French Protestant Christians. Most of them became Calvinistic. It's too early to call them Calvinistic at this point, because Calvin himself has only barely become a Christian, but nevertheless they eventually embraced their countryman John Calvin's vision for the church and theology and so on. So I'm going to call them Huguenots. Nobody knows exactly where that term came from. It may have come from an individual whose name was something like Hugo or Huguenot. It may have been a combination of a French and a German term. I've seen about 3 or 4 different theories. I'm not going to bother you with it. I'm just going to use the term and understand that's who we're talking about. Francis had a great celebration in Paris in 1535. In this, he had a great parade through the streets of Paris. He was exhibiting to the people what were allegedly great trophies and relics in the Catholic possession. Thorns from the thorny crown worn by Jesus, the 2 tablets of the 10 Commandments, and other astonishing relics. And these were being held up before the people in Paris as the possessions of the church, partly to say to them, of course, that this is the repository of the true religion that needs to be followed by all of us. And of course, these folks, generally uneducated, generally willing to trust these ecclesiastical authorities, believed it. The day was punctuated by the burning at the stake of 6 prominent Christian, that is to say, Huguenot leaders there in Paris. And all of that was simply to say by Francis, this nation is Catholic, I am Catholic, we are staying here. And that became more or less the great theme that was established in France at that time. John Calvin, of course, escaped from France. He went to Basel to join his friend Nicolas Cop. He also in the same year produced the first edition of the Institutes of the Christian Religion. In it there is a lengthy preface. The preface is worth the price of admission. So if you ever come across it, you should read it. If this were a college course and I could give you homework, I would assign it and I'd test you on it. It's a wonderful insight into the early mind of John Calvin as a member of the Reformation now. It's also a great insight into the state of the church at the time, and it's a great representation of really what was going on in France at the time, because all of this is reflected now in this preface to the Institutes written by Calvin in 1536. So it's well worth your reading if you ever have a chance to do that. All right, as I say, Renee was the daughter of Louis XII. She is inherited now by Francis when she's 5 years old, and she is going to be cared for by Francis, and he hired an English governess named Madame de Souby, that's a French name, but she was actually English, to educate and care for Renee. And so Madame de Souby shows up. She's a very respectable, scholarly woman. She's very competent. She's English, but of course fluent in multiple languages. She has in her luggage contraband, the Wycliffe Bible. Of course, at this point, the Tyndale Bible isn't available. The Wycliffe Bible had been around in England, of course, for 100 years. It was illegal. There have been many that have been burned. But she had one of these remarkable possessions, and she had it tucked away in her luggage, and she brought it with her from England to France and used it in the education of Renee, partly to learn English, partly to learn the Bible. And so Madame de Souby becomes the first influence in René's life. And keep in mind, this is before the Reformation. The Reformation is not going. This is simply the Wycliffe Bible and reading from it that does seem to plant in the heart of René a deep love for the Scripture and really an appreciation for something of the simplicity of the gospel, faith in Christ, and that kind of simple trust in Him that became in many ways the calling card of the Protestant Reformation. So she's already a little bit of a Reformation spirit before the Reformation has even really gotten off the ground. At 18 years of age, when in the year 1528, Francis marries René off to the crown prince of a little province in Italy called Ferrara. So Ferrara, you can see there, is toward the north of Italy, north of Rome certainly. It was an independent duchy. And Francis was hoping by this political liaison, through this his niece, to establish closer ties with this rather strategically located province there in Italy. And so she marries, or René marries then this fellow named Ercole, who is the duke in Ferrara. They have 3 children. The first is Anna, the second is Alfonso, who would eventually rule Ferrara, and the third is Lucrezia. Duke Ercole, the husband of René, succeeded to the throne in 1534. So the very year that Francis is coming down with an iron fist against the Huguenots in France, René is now becoming the queen in Ferrara, this young sort of student of the Reformation. We're at 1534 now. She knows about the Reformation. She knows that what she used to read in the Geneva Bible is somewhat comparable to what's being taught now by Luther and these others who are beginning to represent that Reformation spirit. So she, the queen in Ferrara, has that going on in her heart and in her mind. Interestingly, John Calvin himself arrived in Ferrara in 1536. He escaped from France. He went to Basel, as we said earlier, and from there he traveled back to France, but it was still too hot in the kitchen, and so he escaped that time south into Italy and wound up in Ferrara. And he applied for a job. And the job, he's 26 years old now, 27, something like that. Well, let's see, it's 1536, that's about right. And he applies for a job there as the personal secretary to René of Ferrara, the queen. And she hires him. And they formed a long-standing friendship and a tight, close relationship in which he, of course, was able to impress upon her in a far more profound way than she'd ever seen it before, the distinctive teachings of the Protestant Reformation. And that's when she really did, in many ways, simply imbibe this deeply, and it became part of her DNA. I'm trying to think myself, if I had John Calvin as my personal secretary, I don't think I would say very much, you know. This would be quite an experience, and that was René's privilege to have this remarkable man. He was only there, as I say, for about 6 months. At this time, her husband, Ercole, was not necessarily all that hostile to the Reformation or to Calvin, but that hostility did develop later on as time went on. Duke Ercole increasingly began to see the political implications of the Reformation. And of course, Ferrara is not a powerful kingdom. It's just kind of a little region that certainly is surrounded by powerful Catholic enemies, should they go with the Protestant movement. And so he, more or less for political reasons, becomes increasingly hostile to his wife René and to her sympathies for the Reformation. And she, of course, becomes increasingly interested in, especially the Huguenot cause in France. Because now there's increasing violence, there's increasing persecution, and she wants to do everything she can to help out. And so at great personal risk and great personal expense, she does whatever she can, providing money, providing resources, providing all kinds of sort of under the radar, various sorts of assistance and so on to the Huguenot cause in France. She is French. She loves her country, and there's nothing she would like better than to see France go in the direction of the Reformation. But she's having to do it now against the resistance of her husband and against various political forces that are mounting against her. This entire thing more or less culminated with an incident involving a guy named Fanino Fanini. I love that. Fanino Fanini, an Italian preacher, strong advocate of the Reformation. There were a lot of these people running around that we've never heard of. He happened to wind up in Ferrara, and he was preaching, and René was supporting him. Husband Ercole didn't like it very much, but he was preaching to huge crowds, became very popular, and finally Ercole had him arrested. This was a couple of years before the incident we have here. Threw him in prison. René protested, of course, and pleaded with tears to her husband not to do this. It was an awful crime against a great Christian preacher and teacher, but nevertheless, Ercole was committed, put him in prison, but it so happened that the prison cell that he put him in was about 3 floors up and had a window with bars in it. And so Fanino Fanini would preach from prison. And people would gather out in the prison courtyard in large numbers and listen to the man preaching from inside the prison cell, you see. And he still was having a huge effect on... So finally, Ercole, in frustration, threw him into a dungeon where he would be completely incommunicado. And then in 1550, he finally committed the ultimate crime in René's opinion and had him burned at the stake in Ferrara. She was outraged, she was upset beyond all description at this, and this really was kind of the final nail in the coffin of what had been their marriage, and they more or less are completely split. He has political reasons that he really can't do more against her at this point, but he does about as much as he can to more or less disenfranchise her. All right. Back at the ranch, back in France, Francis I dies in 1547. So we've looked at his life briefly. This brings now Henry II. There's 2 Henry IIs. This is the second Henry II. So anyway, this is Henry II of France. He is the second-born son of Francis. The firstborn son died. He marries one of the most strategic women of the day, a woman by the name of Catherine de' Medici. When he's 14 years old, she's also a teenager. Catherine de' Medici is kind of the last surviving figure of the de' Medici clan there in Italy. She's quite wealthy, she's well connected, she's a strong, powerful Roman Catholic personality. She's the great-granddaughter of Lorenzo the Great, who was sort of the heart of the Renaissance there in Florence, you recall. So this is who she is, quite a strategic marriage, and he marries her. So Henry II marries Catherine de' Medici. He then becomes, at 28 years old, the king, and of course Catherine is ruling with him as queen of France, 1547. He continued the policies of Francis I and even ramped up the pressure. He realized that France was slipping away. By this moment in France, 40% of French nobility were aligned with the Huguenots. 40%, you see, of the critical mass, you might say, of the French upper class was committed to the Reformation, and an incalculable number at the popular level also were. This is why I say France itself was, at this moment, hard to call. Which way would it go? Because certainly to the north, the nations had generally gone with the Reformation, though to the south, they'd stayed with the Catholic Church. And France was sort of postured there in the middle. Which way would they go? And there were many, many people hoping and praying, of course, that France itself was going to follow suit with many other countries that had repudiated the authoritarian presence of the Catholic Church and had opened the doors for greater religious liberty to some degree, and certainly for a Protestant representation there as well. So this is what Henry II is facing when he becomes king at this point. This is the same Henry II who took in Mary Queen of Scots the following year. So last week we talked about Mary Queen of Scots. These dots connect, I hope, a little bit. So this is when she shows up. She's 5 years old. He marries her off, Francis II, and he will become the king, of course, in about 10 years. So that's the same Henry that we talked about then. Jean marries. Now remember Jean d'Albret, this is Navarre, over there down in Spain. She marries a French nobleman whose last name is Bourbon. In France at the time, there are three noble families. The Guise family, strong Catholic. The Montmorency family, weak Catholic. The Bourbon family, somewhat strong Protestant. So you've got an interesting constellation of noble personalities there in France. This man, Antoine Bourbon, was of the Bourbon family and was at least officially Protestant. I think the state of his heart was a very different matter, but at least that was his outward commitments. He marries now Jean, who is the heir to the throne in Navarre, and they marry in 1548. Back in Ferrara, sorry, I don't know any other way to do this, just you're doing fine. Back in they all happen together and they all kind of intersect, so I have to do it this way. Back in Ferrara, Ercole has finally had it up to here with his wife Renee. This is 4 years after the execution of Fanino. And he finally, under political pressure, surrounded by Catholic forces all around, basically accuses his wife, Renee, of heresy, has her imprisoned, has her stripped of her status. This was a risky thing to do because she is the daughter of the French king, Louis XII. Now, he's dead, but she still has status. And for him to take those kind of actions against her was risky. But he's getting enough pressure that he feels he has to do it. And so that's exactly what happens. He hires inquisitors from France to come and try to break her, forcing her to recant her Protestant outlook and to embrace the Catholic Church. For 1 year, they basically torment her in her prison situation, doing everything they can to try to get her to repudiate the Reformation. She holds firm until finally they play a trump card that even she can't resist, and that is they say to her, if you don't recant the Protestantism and embrace the Catholic cause, you will never see your daughters again. And she broke. She loved her daughters, and so she did. She signed a document essentially repudiating the Reformation, embracing the Catholic Church and the Catholic theology. We know it was not heartfelt because she never went to a Mass. She refused in principle to go to a Catholic church, and so for the next 4 years, she essentially has to exist in Ferrara without a religion, you see. She signed the document. The document, however, was used to great effect throughout France. Here's the daughter, this famous Protestant spirit, the daughter of Louis XII, who's finally recognized the error of her ways, and so that document was reproduced and spread throughout France for PR purposes, of course, as you can probably imagine. All right, so Renee is no longer able to support the Huguenot cause in France, but just about the time Renee is more or less incapacitated, Jean, who is ruling in Navarre as the queen, picks up the cause. And so she now begins to make Navarre a sort of refuge for Huguenot forces. Her husband, Antoine, is a Bourbon, he's a Protestant, and so it becomes a kind of safe haven, and she sponsors Huguenot ministers to come for training, for education, for reprieve, before going back into the lion's den, you see, in France and so on, and she becomes quite an important character. This is all happening about 1555. Henry II, ruling France, realizes that he's losing this battle against the Protestants. He makes what came to be called the Catholic Alliance. He makes a deal, a truce, with Philip II. Spain and France didn't like each other that much. They were competitors in many different quarters. And so he had to kind of swallow a bitter pill to do this. Philip II we've talked about before. He was the king of Spain all during this time. He was married to Mary Tudor of England. He tried to marry Queen Elizabeth. Remember that? He sent the Spanish Armada. That's the same guy. So Henry II forms this truce with Philip II, in which the two of them are going to join forces to rid France of the Huguenots. Henry is so excited, he calls a big celebration. And in this celebration, he gets drunk. And in his drunkenness, he says, you know what would be a great idea? I think I want to do a joust. And so he insists, he's the king, what are you going to do, argue with him? So, drunk, he gets in the saddle, and in the joust, he's killed. So in the celebration for his truce with Philip II, that's the end of Henry II, who is Francis II. Doesn't this get confusing? You're doing so well. Thank you. This is Francis II, the husband of Mary, Queen of Scots. And so now he takes the throne at the death of his father at age 15. He is of the house of Guise. Mary, Queen of Scots, is of the house of Guise. Her mother was Mary Guise, you recall that. And so they represent the strongest faction of Catholic nobility in France at this point. He's ruling, and he continues the policies and actually ramps up even more the hostility to the Huguenots. Now, he's only 15, so he's doing this more under the control of and the heavy influence of Catherine de' Medici, and she is more or less running the shop now with this very young person for whom she's really serving as the regent. So during all these years, Catherine de' Medici in many ways is the major player, the major strategist of the French response to the Huguenots. Renée was living in Ferrara. However, in 1559, her husband Ercole died. Her son Alfonso succeeded to the throne. You would think that'd be good news for Renée. But Alfonso had been so completely touched and influenced by the forces of the Catholic view of things that he basically indicated that he was going to be more harsh with his mother than his father had been. And Renée realized that he was capable of doing that. She fled. She was able to orchestrate an escape and make it back from Ferrara, back to the home she loved, the nation she loved, back to France, having to come in more or less under cover of darkness. And her son, Alfonso, is now ruling in Ferrara. When she arrives in France, she is heartbroken because what she sees is that the entire country is now being ripped apart by violence. By this time, of course, the Huguenot cause is being represented in many cases by violent skirmishes. And so this is becoming what looks very much like a civil war, at least a civil conflict that is evolving. And she is so concerned for her beloved France and seeing it in this state that she goes back to her family holdings and a castle called Montargis, which was hers by right. She owned it because she was nobility in France. She hadn't lost her status in France. She takes it over, opens the doors for anyone who wants to come as a safe haven. Catholic or Protestant, she doesn't care. If you want to get out of this bloodbath to a safe place, you may come here. And so she opens the doors, and she does that right about 1559, 1560, when France itself is right on the verge of open civil war. And so she has a rather strategic role to play back in France. Antoine remember, he's supposed to be a Bourbon, he's supposed to be a Protestant. He's feeling so much heat by the surrounding Catholic forces that he basically reneges on his Protestantism, abandons his wife Jean, goes back to France to fight for the Catholic cause. So we have another unhappy marriage, split down the rift there, the fault line of this religious difference. Antoine goes back to France. Jean is left ruling Navarre in her own right. On Christmas Day of 1560, she declares Navarre officially Protestant. She does so again at great risk because she's not a powerful military force and she is surrounded by Catholic countries on all sides, so she could easily be overwhelmed by this if that were to actually happen. All right, Francis II, the husband of Mary, Queen of Scots, died in 1560. I said there's a lot of moving parts. Mary, Queen of Scots, under duress, goes back to Scotland. We talked about that story last week. And the successor now is Charles IX, who is the third son, or the fourth son. These are all brothers, you see, who are ruling in succession because they all die rather early. And still, Catherine de' Medici is running the show. He is only 10 years old at the time. He's the brother of his predecessor, Francis. And now for the next 10 years, France is torn apart by what amounts to a true, genuine civil war between fairly powerful Protestant forces on the one hand and very powerful, probably more powerful, Catholic forces on the other. There is help coming in from all sides. Elizabeth is helping out the Protestant side. Jean d'Albret is helping out. Of course, the Catholic countries are helping out. So in many ways, France now is just becoming a horrible scene of bloodshed and so on for the next several years. Antoine, the husband of Jean, died in a siege of a Protestant city named Rouen in 1562. So she is now ruling in her own right, independently. She declares Navarre a place of religious freedom. That is to say, you can be there a Catholic, you can be there a Protestant, doesn't matter to her. She, of course, is a Protestant, but she is declaring religious freedom within this. This is one of the most remarkable and advanced kinds of experiments of the day. It's the very same thing that Renee did. She's not trying to beat people into being Protestants. She's simply giving religious freedom at this point, but there's not going to be persecution going either way. So these two women, kind of pursuing a parallel career, Jean in Navarre outside of France, and Renee within France, but both of them adopting this kind of policy. A cardinal came and visited Jean, who, of course, as I say, is taking this position of religious toleration. And this cardinal came and addressed her, and the transcript of his words are recorded for us. He says to her, quote, this is to Jean d'Albret now, the Queen of Navarre, "Your Majesty, you are being misled by evil men who want to plant a new religion in Navarre. If you go ahead with this, you will never succeed. Your subjects will not stand for it, and your enemies will stop you. You do not have an ocean to protect you like Queen Elizabeth of England. Madam, don't let these Huguenot murderers, rebels, and heretics ruin your conscience, your goods, and your grandeur. I implore you with tears to return to the true fold." Jean d'Albret responded, quote, "Your feeble arguments do not dent my tough skull. I am serving God, and He knows how to protect His cause. Our ministers preach nothing but obedience, patience, and humility. Keep your tears for yourself. I pray from the bottom of my heart that you will be brought back to the true fold and the true shepherd." Meantime, Renee is under siege at Montague. Catholic forces have laid siege to her castle there. Again, she doesn't have the wherewithal to defend herself, but it is a siege. They're kind of establishing a perimeter. The commander of the Catholic forces there met with her in an attempt to negotiate a resolution of this, telling her that there was no possible way she could succeed. She would lose this contest, to which she responded, this is Renee now, quote, "Consider well what you are planning to do. There is no one in this kingdom who commands me except the king himself. If you come, I will throw myself into the breach and see whether you will have the audacity to kill the daughter of a king." She is, after all, the daughter of Louis XII. She is the aunt of the reigning king, Charles IX. She's playing her cards here, you know. Who knows what the outcome would be, but in any event, the guy backed off. And so she continued to be able to maintain Montague as a kind of place of refuge. And it came to be called among the Huguenots at the time the Hotel of the Lord. This was the place where you could go for refuge in the midst of a war-torn country, whether Protestant or Catholic, and many of both sides came there for protection under Renee. All right. I have just enough time to tuck in this rather unhappy story, and then we'll have to leave off at this point. This war continued for about 10 years between the Huguenots on the one hand and the Catholic forces on the other. The outcome remained uncertain, but eventually in about the year 1570, both sides were saying there's got to be a better way here. And so there was a truce that was negotiated, and the terms of the truce were these. The son of Jean d'Albret, the Queen of Navarre, whose name was Henry. Why didn't they name their kid something like Bob or Frank? You know, it's always Henry's. But anyway, Henry, who would be Henry III of Navarre, is going to marry the sister of the King of France, Charles IX. He is Protestant, she is Catholic. Jean d'Albret had deep misgivings about this. She was concerned about her son. She was concerned about whether this was even a workable thing, but she was also aware of how much violence had torn France apart, and she decided, for prudential reasons, her hopes and prayers being that this would be at least a door to some better situation in France, she agreed to the marriage of her son, Henry, to Margaret. The marriage was to take place in 1572. This is a later shot of her son. He was a young guy at the time. She goes to Paris to plan for the wedding along with Catherine de' Medici. Strangely, Jean dies. She fell gravely ill, was dead within about a week. There was a widespread conviction that she had been poisoned. However, the official ruling of an autopsy, and I don't know how sophisticated autopsies were at that day, maybe some of the MDs in the room could help out there, but in any event, the ruling was that she died of natural causes and that it wasn't foul play, so I have no opinion on that, but anyway, she did die. It was about 2 months before the scheduled wedding. The wedding nevertheless proceeded 2 months later. This would be in August. And at the wedding, Henry, the son of Jean, would marry Margaret. They did marry. 4 days later, the King of France, Charles IX, at the instruction of his mother, Catherine de' Medici, gave the order that every Huguenot in Paris and throughout France should be killed. This was the classic double cross, came to be called the St. Bartholomew Day Massacre. You see, the Huguenots thought they could lay down their arms, and they did. They thought we now have a truce, and they were correct, they did have a truce. They thought that this was finally a door to a better time of negotiating and maybe some religious tolerance, and so they were completely vulnerable at this point. They had no ability to defend themselves, and it was at that moment of high vulnerability that the order was issued, and it became one of the most infamous moments of all of the Reformation story, the St. Bartholomew Day Massacre. There were many throughout Europe, even those sympathetic to the Catholic side, who viewed this as an inexcusable and awful, dishonest breach of faith. And it did have a very negative effect on the Catholic image for some time to come. And you've probably all heard of the St. Bartholomew Day Massacre, and I don't know if you knew the backstory, but this is kind of how it all took place. Henry was Protestant, of course. He was the son of Jean. He narrowly escaped death. He was slated to be killed. He was the new husband of Margaret, unless he immediately pledged loyalty to the Catholic Church, which he did. And so he escaped death by converting to Catholicism. Charles IX, the boy, king, dies at 23 of broken health. I think there's a widespread opinion that he himself felt such crushing guilt over what had happened that he found it intolerable, and he himself died only a couple of years later. René of Ferrara died the same year, 1574, 2 years after the St. Bartholomew Day Massacre. One historian wrote of her, quote, "For the next 2 years she endured sickness and pain and did what she could to preserve life. She died among her Christian friends, but was separated from her children who rejected her religious beliefs. The King of France forbade her body to be laid to rest at Saint Denis, where French kings and queens and their children were buried. René's body was placed in a simple wooden casket and buried without ceremony within her castle walls. In her will, she left a long statement of her faith in Christ, and concluded with a note to her children. Quote, "I pray that my children will read and listen to the Word of God, in which they will find comfort and the true guide to eternal life." So both of these remarkable women, heroic women who had such a powerful impact on this very, very difficult time in French history, were, I think, rightly called wonderful benefactors of the work of God. And to me, they are heroes of mine, and I hope I've helped them to become the same for you. When Paul wrote about Phoebe, he was writing and establishing what amounts to a paradigm that not only has described many women, but many men, and throughout history we find those who are kind of, in many ways, behind the scenes. You may recall the story of King David, who went on a military excursion, came back with booty, and some people said that those who had stayed behind shouldn't share in the booty. They had been too tired, too weak, too injured, and so on to go into the battle. King David established a rule in Israel that those who stay behind and support are going to share with those who go into the battle and fight. That there is going to be an appreciation not only for those who are on the front lines risking their lives, but for those who are supporting them behind the scenes. That became a rule in Israel. It's a proper rule in the church. Some of us go out and fight on the front lines. Some of us stay behind and pray and help and give and do everything we can to support them. God gives different gifts to different people. These women did both. They were on the front lines, obviously, at certain points. They were behind the scenes at other points. They did what God called them to do. And as Paul himself says, the chief test of a steward before God is that he or she be found faithful. Every one of us in this room is a steward. Some of us have played a role on the front lines occasionally. All of us have had an opportunity at least to be part of the support system on the back. And either way, God blesses and gives us the grace that is intended for us to carry out our duties. And I hope that the story of Renee and Jean has helped us to do it better.